I'd like you to imagine a time, let's say, 10,000 years BCE. Two early men, cavemen if you will, are sitting next to each other on a rock. One of them, we'll call him Ugg, says to his friend, Grog, "Hey, do you see that big rock up there in the sky?" And Grog looks at Ugg and says, "Yeah, what about it?" Ugg says, "I think we could get there. I mean, if we're sitting on a rock like this right now, what's stopping us from going and sitting on a rock like that someday?" And Grog scoffs at Ugg and says, "You idiot. To get to something that high, you need to fly, like that bird over there." And Ugg, being a fan of the not yet invented Socratic method, asks, "Well, if those birds are flying, what's stopping us from flying?" And Grog, being a man of logic, says, "Humans don't have wings. We'll never be able to fly." And Grog ends the conversation as many early men did, by whacking Ugg on the head with a club. Now, Grog would be right about one thing, that humans don't have wings. However, his statement that humans would never be able to fly would be disproven, a mere 11,783 years later. On the 19th of September 1783, in Versailles, France, the Montgolfier brothers invented and flew the very first hot air balloon, allowing mankind to finally defy gravity. As the 19th century began, another new aerodynamic innovation was made, the parachute, allowing man to fall from any height slowly and therefore without harm. These two inventions, the hot air balloon and the parachute, popularized the hot thrill of the 1800s, the balloon jump. Above an altitude of about 4.5 kilometers, people start to suffer from oxygen deprivation. A balloon jump by James Glacier and Henry Coxwell demonstrated this when the two lost consciousness past this altitude, with one of them barely managing to cut the valve cord and let the balloon descend. This prompted the idea that to go higher than that, supplemental oxygen was needed. All these balloon jumps are interesting and all, and they provided lots of information on how to break previous altitude records. But that's last century's news. The year now is 1957, and the Soviet Union is about to start one of the greatest science competitions of all time, the space race. In October of 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the very first artificial satellite. It wasn't much, weighing only 83 kilograms and providing some information about the upper atmosphere of the Earth using some instruments, but it was a great start. It circled Earth every 96 minutes, meanwhile collecting this info. This is what ultimately made the USA want to explore what's up there, not only to collect that info, which would be a great scientific feat, but to prove that the USA could do whatever the Soviets could do. The Cold War was still on, after all. More satellites were launched by the Russians in the 50s. Sputnik 2 carried the first living being into space, a stray dog named Laika, though the dog only survived a few hours in space due to a cooling problem which exploded the satellite. Sputnik 3 was launched in May 1958 and was substantially bigger than its simple predecessors. It carried 12 instruments to further study the upper atmosphere in space, and it was intended to be the first satellite to launch, but due to its complexity, it needed more work, so Sputnik 1 was chosen to launch instead. These satellites were extraordinary innovations, and fascinated scientists in both the USSR and the USA. However, the Soviet Union wouldn't stop at just sending metal spheres into orbit. On April 12, 1961, the USSR launched Vostok 1, which carried the first man into space, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin. He recorded his experience while in space using a tape recorder, the recordings of which are still preserved today. This delivered a large shock to the USA, who had planned to launch a man into space at just around the same time. Now, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, was going to do their best to beat the Soviets in the space race and launch a man of their own into orbit. The Mercury program was established, a series of one-man spacecraft meant to see if the Americans could send a man to space and return him home safely. Their first flight, the Mercury Freedom 7, carrying Alan B. Shepard Jr., was launched just 3 weeks after Vostok 1 and was a suborbital flight which lasted a mere 15 minutes. NASA would try again, and this time they would beat the Russians in orbit count. The Friendship 7, carrying John Glenn Jr., was launched in February 1962 and completed 3 orbits around the Earth, 2 more than Vostok 1. This was followed by Mercury's final flight, Faith 7, which carried L. Gordon Cooper Jr. and completed 22 successful orbits around the Earth before re-entry. It was around this time that the US President, John F. Kennedy, gave a very famous speech.
There is no strife, no prejudice, no national conflict in outer space as yet. Its hazards are hostile to us all. Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
NASA's second space program, Gemini, would be established in 1964. It was a series of 12 two-man spacecraft meant to test the astronauts' ability to maneuver the spacecraft via manual control, and to test the capabilities of multiple astronauts in one spacecraft. Gemini 4 marked the first performed spacewalk by Ed White, who moved outside the spacecraft for 20 minutes to demonstrate that man could function and work in space. Gemini 5, launched August 1965, marked the longest-lasting mission up to that point, spanning 8 days. Gemini 12, launched November 11, 1966, was the last of the Gemini missions and made the first automatically controlled re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Now, while the USA was making lots of progress in space travel, they were still locked in Earth's orbit. With their third space program, they were going to complete the task that President Kennedy had assigned to them years ago. The Apollo space program was designed to test all the procedures necessary to perform a successful moon landing. The most complex procedure being orbital rendezvous. The spacecraft was to be composed of 3 parts. The command module, or the CM, which held the 3 astronauts, the service module, or SM, which carried the fuel, and the lunar module, the LM, the component that would be landing on the moon with the astronauts inside it. The command and service modules were connected, and so the two are generally referred to as the command and service module, or CSM. A powerful Saturn rocket would be the launch vehicle for this 50-ton spacecraft, and placed it in lunar trajectory. The LM had a descent stage and an ascent stage. One astronaut would stay in the CSM, which was temporarily discarded in lunar orbit, and the other 2 would stay in the LM to complete the descent stage and land on the moon. After the descent stage was complete, the ascent stage was ready to begin. In the ascent stage, the LM was flown back to the CSM, the astronauts would board the CSM and begin their flight back to Earth. The LM did not need to return back to Earth. Before re-entry into Earth's atmosphere, the service module was jettisoned, or detached, from the CM to burn up, and the CM will land in the ocean. Simple, isn't it? Unfortunately, NASA's third space program, Apollo, didn't start off too smoothly. A tragic accident that occurred in the cabin of Apollo 1 delayed the mission. A fire broke out in the cabin, killing the crew inside. The cause? Pure oxygen and an exposed wire. If you know about the method to test for oxygen in a test tube, you would know that you place a glowing splint in, and if it bursts into flames, then you can be sure that there's oxygen in that tube. However, we already knew that there was an atmosphere of pure oxygen in the spacecraft's cabin. All that was left was the glowing splint. An exposed wire from underneath the control deck reacted with the oxygen in the cabin, bursting into flames and using the flammable Velcro within the spacecraft as a fuel, and the type of hatch installed in Apollo 1 was difficult to open and slow, leaving the astronauts stuck within the cabin. Luckily, the next mission, Apollo 2, was a successful 3-man flight. Apollo 7, launched in October of 1968, completed a total of 163 orbits around the Earth carrying 3 astronauts, but these missions still only flew around the Earth. The end goal was to fly to the moon. Right before Christmas, 1968, Apollo 8 launched. This mission was what proved to everyone that flying farther than Earth's orbit was possible. It successfully completed 1 lunar orbit before re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Now, this wasn't as simple as the crew waiting to finish the orbit while Mission Control read them stories. Quite the opposite, really. When the crew reached a certain point in the moon's orbit, the signal for communicating with Mission Control was lost. This meant the location of the crew could only be determined through calculated estimates for Mission Control, and there was no telling what would happen if something went wrong behind the moon. To everyone's delight, the mission was a success. Apollo 9 and 10 were focused primarily on testing the lunar module, its descent and ascent stages, and refining the lunar rendezvous process. NASA was getting closer with every mission to fulfilling Kennedy's dream of putting a man on the moon. All the steps had been tested individually. All that was left was to put them all together in one mission. Apollo 11 was launched on July 16, 1969 from Pad 39A at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Like all the other Apollo missions, this was a three-man spacecraft carrying Commander Neil Armstrong, Lunar Module pilot Edwin Buzz Aldrin, and Command Module pilot Michael Collins. Almost every part of Apollo 11 was televised, including the launch at 1:32 p.m. US EDT. As the spacecraft came closer to the moon, it slowed down so that it could more easily enter lunar orbit. The spacecraft completed one elliptical orbit around the moon, then an almost completely circular orbit. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin boarded the lunar module. At this point, the spacecraft became two separate spacecraft: Columbia, the control module, being piloted by Collins, and Eagle, the lunar module, containing Armstrong and Aldrin. When Eagle undocked from Columbia, it entered a nearly circular orbit, similar to the one that Apollo 11 had took earlier. Then, it changed its orbit from circular back to elliptical, and the closest point that it came to the moon was only 15 kilometers above its surface. The engines in Eagle were fired to initiate the descent maneuver.
Okay, engine stop. Copy it down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Twink.
At 10:56 p.m. EDT, Armstrong stepped out of the LM onto the lunar ground and said,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
In the excitement of the moment, Armstrong skipped the A in the statement that he had prepared. Aldrin followed Armstrong soon after, making them the first and second humans on the moon. During the moonwalk that Armstrong and Aldrin performed, the two set up three scientific devices: a device to measure the composition of the solar wind reaching the moon, a device to receive laser beams from observatories on Earth to help determine the exact distance of the Earth to the moon, and a passive seismometer to measure moonquakes, or moon earthquakes, and the impacts of meteors long after the crew had returned to Earth. The two collected 23 kilograms of samples of rock and soil from the moon, took many photos, and kept constant communication with Mission Control in Houston. After spending 21 hours on the moon's surface, the two initiated Eagle's ascent stage and redocked with Columbia and Collins. The control module of Apollo 11 landed in the Pacific Ocean near Hawaii on July 24, 1969. The crew were then immediately placed in a 21-day quarantine to check for any diseases they may have contracted during the journey. Then, the samples were subjected to preliminary analysis. And with that, Kennedy's dream, as well as countless other space enthusiasts' dreams, were fulfilled. The USA hadn't been the first to get a man in orbit, but instead, they were the first to do something far more impressive. The space race in many people's eyes was the highlight of the mid-20th century, with great scientific feat after great scientific feat being achieved. It was supposed to be proof of superiority during the Cold War, but really, it was proof that humans could innovate, can innovate, and will continue to innovate. And, as we've seen throughout history, not even gravity could stop us.
Oh no. My headphones came unplugged like 40 minutes ago. You were talking about cavemen, something like that?
Forget it.
I paint pictures, make them easy to see. When I put together the beat, you can never compete. I paint pictures, make them easy to see. When I put together the beat, you can never compete.